Today we're going to be looking at the topic of water, both in general terms and how how it relates to agricultural production. Just a little brief discussion about water as a molecule and how it behaves the way it does. Compared to other molecules of similar molecular weight, it's very unusual in its physical properties. It expands upon freezing. Most other liquids, when you freeze them, they will contract, and this causes ice to float, which is pretty important, because if ice did not float, what would happen eventually on this planet is all the water would freeze and sink to the bottom of the ocean and stay there. In other words, very quickly, all of the water, liquid water that we have on this planet would turn to solid. It has a high surface tension. It's highly cohesive. The water molecules like to stay together. They like to cling to one another. They have a very high affinity for one another. One of the reasons for this is the configuration of the molecule itself. It sort of has the two hydrogens that's sort of hanging over here to one side. Oxygen, of course, has a net negative charge. The molecule hydrogen has a positive charge. So what this results is a molecule here that has sort of a high degree of polarity. In other words, it has a positive charge on one side and a negative charge on the other, and it is these positive charges on one end that seek out the negative charges on the other and result in the high affinity that water molecules have for one another. Some of you might recall chemistry. They talk about this degree of separation here, this angle, and I don't remember what it is. I'm sure if you've had chemistry lately, you'd remember, but there's a specific angle for these two hydrogen molecules to join up with this oxygen molecule. Water is transparent, of course. It's clear, pretty much. It does bend light rays to some extent, but we can see through it generally. Water is a universal inert solvent. It is almost anything, or a great number of things, are soluble in water. And in fact, it is this solubility and mixability with other things that makes it an ideal place for the reactions of life. All the things that we've talked about so far, respiration, photosynthesis, other metabolic pathways, take place in an aqueous environment. And while some of these molecules may not be in solution, they are definitely in suspension. They're in water, and water is it's inert, basically. Water does not only is something that a lot of things can be dissolved in and a lot of things are mixed with, but basically it does not, because it's a very stable molecule, generally does not enter into the reaction itself. If we wish to break this bond between hydrogen and oxygen up here, again, it's a very stable molecule overall, but if we want to break this bond, it takes a lot of energy to do that, and we can do that. This is one of the ways in which we can generate hydrogen for various energy needs, because when we reconvert that hydrogen back into water by burning it in the presence of oxygen, creating water, then we can recapture a lot of the energy that it took to expend to get this hydrogen molecule away from the oxygen. Water also has a very high specific heat. In other words, it takes a lot of energy to move the temperature of water, and specific heat is the amount of heat required to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So water tends to be a very stabilizing influence on the planet. It stabilizes our environment by for example, the Gulf Stream, for example, travels from the southern part of the United States all the way up the Atlantic to England. And England has a very mild climate, even though they're very far north, due to the mitigating influence of the water that surrounds that country. And it's the same in lots of places. We have several areas here in our country that are in close proximity to large bodies of water, the Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes of New York, and others that have a very mitigating and very mild effect on the climate for that area. Now, the fact of the matter is that water is not only is, as it says here, it should say one of, and it doesn't say that, but it really should say water is the most limiting factor in agricultural production. Most of the farmer's time, if they're involved in crop production, is involved in managing water, either through managing irrigation or praying for rain. It takes water to raise crops in any cropping system, regardless of the quality of the soil and regardless of almost any other environmental factor. You've got to have water. How much water does it take to produce various agricultural commodities? Well, it's calculated that to produce one egg takes 120 gallons of water. Now, there's obviously not 120 gallons of water in one egg, and since a chicken can generally lay about one egg per day, it's obvious also that it's not necessary for a chicken to drink 120 gallons of water every day. What is necessary, though, is for that chicken to consume a bit of grain, corn, soybean, or whatever else is in the ration for that bird, and it takes water to produce those commodities. And so that's where the 120 gallon figure comes from. It takes 300 gallons of water to produce a loaf of bread. It takes 3,500 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. Again, the beef animal does not drink that much water, but it takes a lot of water to produce the feed. A single corn plant transpires about 200 liters or about 50 gallons of water in its lifetime. One single corn plant. And when you look at a corn population of somewhere in the neighborhood of, say, 28,000 plants per acre, you can multiply this out and see about how much water is transpired by the corn plant in an acre of corn production. This is transpiration, not evaporative water loss or any other water loss, evaporative water loss or gravitational water loss. This is just through running the water through the plant. So it takes a lot of water in agriculture. Some of the functions in the plant that water does, we've already seen some of those functions. We know, for example, that it's a solvent for nutrient uptake. Most of the nutrients that plants obtain from the soil, the ammonium ions, the potassium ions, phosphates, other ions that are taken up, are dissolved in water, and so it is a solvent for those nutrients. And we know that it's necessary for photosynthesis. It is a part of the photosynthetic reaction. It is 12 molecules of water in, 6 back out. So there's a net water consumption in the photosynthetic reaction. It functions as a coolant for the plant during hot periods through the process of transpiration. Water loss from the leaf cools down the plant. And it functions to maintain turgidity. It maintains the water status of the plant. A plant that is erect and growing has a lot of water in it. As it transpires this water through the leaves, more water is taken up by the roots. You have this continuous passing of water through the plant and a maintenance of a certain quantity of water within the plant. This functions to open the stomates, keeps remember the guard cells that surround stomates have to be open, and this should be stomatal opening. Keeping those stomates open is done so by a good water status. As the water status becomes less favorable, as the leaves lose water, those guard cells will collapse due to the lack of this water. And when that happens, no gases get in, no gases get out. It keeps water from escaping the leaf, but it also keeps CO2 from getting in. So this transient wilting that occurs when plants wilt, a lot of times under very favorable conditions, water conditions that is, plants will wilt in the middle of the day simply because it's very hot and because the sunlight is so bright. Plants cannot maintain their water status, and what happens is, even though there may be plenty of water in the soil, they're losing it at too high a rate from the leaf. So as that happens, they'll wilt temporarily during the day. Hydrangeas are famous for this. If you know about anything about landscape plants, hydrangeas will wilt in the middle of the day very easily, very noticeably so. And of course, this depresses photosynthetic rate at a time when it could be operating at its peak efficiency due to high light intensity. and it gives plants mechanical strength. We think of turgidity as a stiffness in the plant, a turgid plant. On the other end of the scale would be a flaccid plant. Celery, for example, is a good example. When you have celery that's old and in the refrigerator and it's been old for a while, it becomes rubbery. It's not the crisp vegetable that we usually think of celery as being. Celery that's nice and crisp has a lot of mechanical strength. It has a good high water status and a high water content. If you want to restore the mechanical strength of celery that's been in the refrigerator too long and it may be a little flaccid, stick it in some water and leave it for a little while, and it'll absorb that water and return to its usual nice crisp state. And of course, water is also a constituent or a major part of protoplasm. Most protoplasm, or the stuff that cells are made out of, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% water or more. So there's a lot of water. There's a lot of water in people, a lot of water in plants. So again, getting back to this biological importance of water stress, what water stress does to a plant. First of all, when a plant is under water stress, it's cell division, cell elongation, and these are the two main components of growth. This is the way that plants grow. They divide cells. The cells divide, and after division, they elongate or stretch out, leading to growth. And this is going to stop or slow down greatly under water stress because there's no photosynthesis going on. These operations, particularly cell division, cell elongation, require the input of photosynthate. It takes energy to do this, a lot of energy for cells to divide and elongate. So when that energy is coming in, it's coming in the form of sugars from photosynthate. When photosynthesis slows due to water stress, respiration then exceeds photosynthesis and growth will slow down or stop. Again, the stomates. Here's a nice electron micrograph of a stomate here, and this is the opening, the actual place where gases go in and out. This surrounding tissue here is the guard cell or guard cells. There's actually one on either side, and as they collapse, this opening will close, and they will collapse due to a lowering of water availability. So when the plants become lack turgor or turgidity, no CO2 gets in, photosynthesis decreases. So again, at closing, the water leaves. Water is leaving the plant, and when they're open and when it becomes to the point where water cannot be absorbed fast enough, these cells will shrink and collapse. The stoma will close. Again, when they're open, water enters, the cell swells. Water coming in causes these cells to become have good water status or become filled with water, and when they're filled with water, the stoma opens up. Now, recall from the last lecture that we talked about soil and water, and just going to briefly look at that again. We have gravitational water. This is water that's on its way through. It's free water, also called free water, water that moves through the soil with the force of gravity, and it only remains in the soil temporarily. However, it is available to plants while it's there. And then there's the available water. This is capillary water. Once all the gravitational water has left the soil, what remains is available or hygroscopic. And again, of all this water, most of it is available. It's also referred to as capillary water, held in soil pores by capillary forces or the attraction of water molecules to other things, and is available to plants. And then there's hygroscopic water or bound water, bound tightly to soil particles, so tightly that it's unavailable to plants. And again, you can look at the various levels of these types of waters in figure 5.4 in your textbook. So we also talk about water status. There's 3 types of water in soil. There's also 3 different types of water status with regard to or soil water. 3 different types of soil water status, and one of them is saturation capacities. When the soil is completely saturated, you got all 3 types there. You have field capacity. When the gravitational water is gone, only the water that can be held against the force of gravity only at field capacity, you have your maximum amount of available water or capillary water, and then at the wilting point, your capillary water or available water is gone. Roots can no longer extract water when it's only hygroscopic water left. Now, let's talk about water use efficiency. And plant species in particular will differ in the way that they use water with regard to the efficiency with which it's used. And one way that we measure water use efficiency, and there are various ways of doing it, again, this is just one way of doing it, is through a simple relationship here. If we look at the kilograms or liters, and the metric system is very nice about this, you have a volume that's equal, or a weight that is equal to a volume, a kilogram or a liter of water per kilogram of dry matter produced. In other words, how many liters of water, how many kilograms of water does it take to produce a kilogram of dry matter? Now, that's simply what this number represents. Now, again, dry matter is that stuff that's in a plant that once you remove all the water, you harvest the plant above ground, or the whole plant, you can do below ground too, dry it down. What you have left is your dry matter, and that is the sum total of how much growth has occurred in that plant. So for C3 plants, remember we have two different metabolic pathways here that we've discussed, the C3 pathway and the C4 pathway. C3 crops here we have listed alfalfa. It takes 858 kilograms of water to produce 1 kilogram of dry matter. For soybeans, 646. These are estimates and approximations, of course, and summed over numerous experiments, or averaged over numerous experiments. Oat, 635. Wheat, cotton, and barley. These are all about in the same range of water use efficiency. If we look at the C4 plants, however, we see that they are much more efficient users of water in terms of growth, in terms of dry matter produced. They are ranging anywhere from the high 200s up to the high 300s. Now, this doesn't mean that these C4 crops use less water. It means that they may use the same amount of water as C3, but they produce more in terms of dry matter. This is why they're considered to be more efficient in their use of water. Now, again, you might ask the question, why bother with C3 plants, C3 crops, and why invest water in those since we get less in return? Well, the fact of the matter is, again, that you can't grow C4 crops just anywhere. And the fact that they are water use efficient generally means that they need more water, because that's just the nature of the game. Corn is a plant that just does not do very well under dry land conditions unless you have very productive and high quality soils, or unless you have an adequate amount of annual precipitation. Corn is an irrigated crop in a lot of places, and wheat is not, for example. So, and you'll see one dicot here. This is the pigweed. It's very water use efficient. And then you also have this other related thing here that we haven't discussed a whole lot, and that is the tolerance, or the ability of plants to tolerate periods of drought or periods of dry weather. Sorghum is a good example of a plant that is considered to be a drought tolerant plant. Again, sorghum and corn have a similar appearance. They're both grasses. They're both in the grass family. Sorghum comes from Africa. Corn comes from the Americas. But the thing about sorghum is that while corn will go through progressive stages of development with very little ability to stop and start those stages, sorghum can do that. Sorghum can grow, and as long as conditions are favorable, sorghum will grow. And when it becomes dry, sorghum will slow down its growth and just sort of sit there and wait for a rain to happen. So this is a drought tolerance mechanism that sorghum has that corn does not. It is able to escape drought by merely avoiding the drought and sitting there and just waiting for rain to occur. So what are the things we can do as managers to increase water use efficiency? And again, we're not necessarily trying to reduce water use. We're just trying to produce the maximum amount of dry matter that we can on a given amount of water. So some of the things that we can do from a production standpoint are to reduce rainfall runoff. And again, we get a certain amount of rainfall. We don't want that rainfall to leave our field immediately or soon after a rainfall event. We want it to stay in that field to give it time to be absorbed by the soil. Soil cannot absorb all the rainfall at one time. If it's coming down an inch an hour, it can't absorb it fast enough, or an inch in 30 minutes. I've seen it rain an inch in 30 minutes many times in Alabama. And that's too fast for the soil to absorb the water. So what we can do is do contour plowing, that is plow with the slope of the land perpendicular to the slope of the land, whichever directions that slope happens to be running in. We can use terraces. These are built up places in the soil that slow down the water movement when it's moving downhill in the soil, and various other tillage practices that we can do to hold the water in a field to make sure it stays there as long as possible before it runs off. Another thing we can do is to optimize our plant populations. For most crops, we have some variability in or some options that we have with regard to the plant populations that we choose. And what we can do generally is recommended that we reduce plant populations in areas where it's going to be drier. As we move west in the United States to more dry climates, we begin to see a reduction in plant population in those areas. Likewise, if we are irrigated and have high water inputs, we can increase our plant populations. Again, third, we can make sure that water is the only limiting factor that we have. We don't want fertilizer to be a limiting factor. We don't want it to be more limiting than water. So we want to make sure that our crops are well fertilized, and because fertilizer helps promote deep root systems. Deep root systems can get down to where the soil water is and may be stored. In one experiment, for example, here, when corn was grown in poor soil with poor fertility, it had a water use ratio of 2,000, while on fertilized soil it was 350. Again, with the 350 water use efficiency here, the total amount of water was greater. The total amount of water that was used was greater, but it produced a much more, significantly more dry matter, so it was used more efficiently. Another thing you can do is to eliminate weeds. Weeds compete with plants and one of the things they compete with plants for is water. When a weed absorbs a molecule of water from the soil, that's a molecule of water that the plant doesn't get. And unfortunately, we cannot calculate weed dry matter in our production equation. Weed dry matter that is produced is dry matter that is lost to our crop production equation. So eliminate weeds. And planting dates is something else we can manipulate and work with. Earlier that we plant, according to guidelines, we get earlier shading of the soil and less evaporation from the soil. You know, water can be lost from the soil in various ways. One of them is through runoff. One of them is through soil evaporation. And of course, gravitational water loss is also in the equation. But evaporation, or water just evaporating from a soil surface that is bare, is another way to lose water. And if you can eliminate that, we want to channel all the water that we have available to us, or as much of the water that we have available to us as we can, through the plant, through the crop plant, through transpiration. And the more we can do of that, the better we are with our water management. Again, if you plant early, a lot of times your crop will reach maturity before the subsoil moisture is depleted during the summer, and you have a deeper root system when you have critical growth stages. Most plants have stages of growth that are more critical than others. For example, soybean, when the pods are actually filling with the beans inside, that's a very critical growth stage for water. Corn is the same way. When it's filling those grains, it needs a lot of water. Peanut crop, when it's filling those pods below ground with nuts, you need more water. So you have these critical stages where water is needed more, and those usually occur later in the crop growth development. So you need a good deep root system at that point, and you'll get that if you plant earlier. And again, covering of the soil with plant material, not having any bare soil. If you use a row spacing that more efficiently covers the soil surface, use row spacings that are narrow as possible. You know, we have row spacings in this country that can range from 40 inches down to 4 inches. And depending upon which crop you're growing as to which one of these is the most efficient. 30 inches is very common for a lot of crops, for a lot of row crops like corn, soybean, cotton. This is the number of inches between rows. But we can plant closer, particularly with soybean, and a lot of times we don't get benefits from some of these other crops for planting closer rows, but keeping those row spacings as narrow as practical will cover that soil surface with a canopy earlier and help manage that water more efficiently. Here's an experiment that was conducted in corn. It doesn't say anywhere corn anywhere on this slide, but let's put it up here at the top, corn. And we have plant populations. We have 35,000 plants. This is in plants per hectare, by the way, not plants per acre. We'll put that here too. Plants per hectare. Hectare is about 2.2 acres. Plants per hectare. And at two different plant populations and at two different row spacings. And this is going to be about 40 inches, and this is going to be about 20 inches to get these out of metric units, 20 inches and 40 inches. And what we see here is that yield, the highest yield was obtained here at the closest row spacing, 20 inches, and the highest plant population. And if you look at how much water is used, you see that the most water was used over here at the very wide row spacing. Now, maybe some of that left through soil evaporation, soil surface water evaporation, we don't know. One measure of water use efficiency that they made here is in measuring in centimeters of water, that is a depth per megagram of yield. And again, the more water that you use per megagram you want to use less water per megagram yield. So the highest water use efficiency here in this way of definition is here at the narrow row spacing. Regardless of plant population, it was the narrow row spacing that gave you better water use efficiency. The worst one was at the lower plant population at the wide row spacing. So you have a better water use at here because you got better shading and less evaporation from the soil surface. You know, there's other ways you can cover up a soil surface besides using plant canopy to do it. In our agronomic systems, however, most of the time we use row spacings. If you're gardening in a truck crop operation, or your vegetables, if you have a garden at home, what gardeners do is use a lot of mulch. So a little bit about rainfall and its impact, because in most cases we depend upon that for crop production. That is the main way of getting water to a lot of crops, especially in less intensive systems. The main thing that are going to determine what your crop production systems are going to be how much water you get, the amount. There's three ways of measuring it: the total amount, how it's distributed, that is when it occurs, and the intensity, how fast it falls. And these are going to vary widely from place to place. And what we call a crop production system, this is a system of crop production that involves the choice of crop, what crop you're growing, what seeding and fertilizer rates you're going to be using, and the tillage practices that you employ there. And so your rainfall is going to influence these three things. The amount of rainfall you get will have a big influence. If you're getting a lot of rainfall, you have a lot wider crop choices than if your rainfall is very limited. These three things collectively are referred to as the crop and soil management system. The crop and soil management system. So if we look at regions, crop regions classified by rainfall amount, we range anywhere from very arid, where they get less than 10 inches of rainfall a year. This is about 55% of our area. Here, your crop production does not exist unless you irrigate. In your semi-arid areas, you can get crop production here that you have in between 10 and 20 inches of rainfall a year. Semi-arid crop production is possible with a fallow or irrigation. Now, a fallow is something that we haven't really defined yet here. I'll briefly do that. A fallow system is where you don't grow a crop on land every year. You may grow a crop every other year. You may grow a crop every third year. The idea being that if your soil is good enough in these areas, if it has a good water holding capacity, that crop can be grown. Let's say you're fallowing every other year, or growing a crop every other year. You grow a crop, you fallow, you grow a crop, you fallow. You really are growing that crop on 2 years of moisture or 3 years of moisture, depending upon your intervals there. So a fallow is just simply leaving a field fallow or leaving it idle. You have to control your weeds to make sure that the weeds are not losing water during that, not pulling water out of the soil during that fallow year. But this is a very efficient crop production system in certain western parts of the United States. We have our subhumid areas. This is about 20% of our total crop production area, 20 to 40 inches. You got a variety of crop production systems possible. 11% are in the humid regions. This is where we are, the asterisk here. We are in a humid area between 40 and 60 inches of rainfall a year. Some years it doesn't seem like that. Here, our crop and crops and the systems that we use are going to be determined by the distribution of precipitation. When does it occur? You know, all of our precipitation is not uniformly distributed throughout the year. Some months are known and recorded to be wetter than others, and we get quite a bit of our rain here in the wintertime in Alabama when we're not growing any summer crops. So it's coming down when we really actually don't need it so much. And then we have wet areas, about 14% of our cropland area, greater than 60 inches of rainfall a year. Here you're going to need drainage and other water management systems to manage excess water. About 70% of the Earth's surface requires some modification of the water regime to be suitable for intensive crop production. That doesn't mean you can't use extensive crop systems such as in wheat growing areas and other things, but to do intensive crop production, vegetables, high value crops, you're going to have to modify. You're going to have some modification of the water regime. So rainfall in Alabama, how does that add up for us? We mostly get good rainfall in Alabama. It generally exceeds the requirements for good crop yields, but we still have a problem here. We have a lot of problems with rainfall in Alabama. Distribution is a problem. It doesn't rain when we need it to rain, especially during those late summer, July, August period when, and sometimes during June. June tends to be a drier month in Alabama when crops are growing through critical growth stages. Our soils have inherently low water holding capacity, generally due to the high sand content. Remember, I said earlier that in Alabama we have a lot of sandy loams. We have sands, or loamy sands, sandy loam. These soils with this high sand content do not have the good water holding capacity. Our soils have low organic matter. Again, this is another factor that contributes to the low water holding capacity of these soils. And then we have the other thing that we have here is high evapotranspiration rate, which is really translates for us into high temperatures. It's hot down here, and when it's hot, plants need to transpire more to stay cool, and you'll get more water loss. When we talk about, we use this term evapotranspiration, we're talking about water loss by either one of two means, either soil evaporation or transpiration through the plant. So we're talking about the total sum of water loss through that soil, and the term we use there is evapotranspiration. In North Dakota, for example, a kilogram of alfalfa can be grown using 500 kilograms of water. In Texas, that same kilogram of alfalfa takes about 1,000 kilograms of water, simply due to the higher temperatures, higher transpiration rates, and probably poorer water holding capacity of the soil. So some water facts here, just briefly for amusement. What percent of all the Earth's water is fresh water? Very low. about 3%, which would indicate that by subtraction that 97% is salt water and cannot be used for agricultural production. Where is the greatest amount of water, fresh water, found? Well, that's pretty interesting too. It's actually found at the polar ice caps. That's where most of it is, frozen. Once evaporated, a water molecule spends how many days in the air, in the atmosphere on average? About 10 days. What percent of a living tree is water? About 40%. And trees, of course, have a lot of stuff in there that's not water. They have this stuff called wood, cellulose deposited. What percent of your brain is water? That varies widely, I've found in my relationships among people. Some people have a lot of water in their brains, but on average, about 75% of your brain is water. If you took your brain and measured the amount of dry matter, you would only have a small amount. How much water is used to brush your teeth? That varies, but about 2 gallons. I can't imagine why it would take anybody 2 gallons of water to brush their teeth, but this is what the pundits say. Maybe some people leave the water running while they're brushing their teeth. I don't know. 10-minute shower uses how much water? This is much more realistic. About 55 gallons. How much water is used by the average automatic dishwasher? 12 to 20 gallons, depending upon how efficient it is and how new it is. How many gallons of water are used to produce the average domestic automobile? People don't really often enough consider the amount of water that is used by industrial applications, including things like building cars. It takes a lot of water. It takes 39,000 gallons of water to build a car on average. How many gallons of water does the average American use every day? This is not drinking alone, but bathing, washing laundry, washing dishes, other uses. About 200 gallons. A lot of water. It takes a lot of water. How many gallons of water can 1 gallon of gasoline contaminate? People don't think about this too much. If they're spilling gasoline or wasting gasoline or various other things, but a gallon of gasoline can contaminate about 750,000 gallons of water, making it unfit for human consumption. And of course, one of the big challenges that we face on our planet today is lack of water availability. There are many millions, billions of people actually that do not have access to adequate, fresh drinking water, and this is going to become more and more of a problem as we move forward, because I don't know that I have mentioned this figure, but about 70% of all fresh water that we use is used for one purpose, and that is agriculture. Water's not necessarily such a big issue here in Alabama. We have plenty. We have a lot of rivers. We have a lot of lakes. We have access to a lot of water. You move out further west and it becomes much more and more of a problem for them. In Arizona, for example. In California, the Central Valley of California, where we get most of our fruits and vegetables, they are in a very tight water situation there, and they're in a constant fight with the cities along the coast for what available water there is. A lot of people live in California. Unfortunately, it's a very dry place, except up in the north. And there have been a lot of attempts to move water into that area from other areas. People generally fight those. There's been a massive water project going on in China for the past few years, moving water from the wetter areas northeast and northeast China to the drier areas as you move farther west in China. China has a similar water distribution pattern to the United States. The farther west you go, the less water there is, and so they've been able to make some inroads there to get water where there's too much to where there's not enough. Another thing is that there's the same amount of water on Earth today as there was 3 billion years ago. So we're not going to get any more. It's interesting to see where the water that we have came from, and I'm not going to go into all that, but The fact is that we've had this constant amount of water on this planet, and we're probably not going to get any more. Again, 1/2 of the world's population lacks good access to clean drinking water. Amazing. An acre of corn evaporates more water than a lake of the same size, primarily because of surface area. Remember that a lake, if it's an acre, would have an acre of exposure to the atmosphere. With a leaf area index in a cornfield of 3.5, you have 3.5 the amount of surface area there. So you have more water loss from that cornfield than you do from a lake. Here's how much water is required to produce agricultural products. We've looked at this. One egg, 120 gallons. Loaf of bread, 300 gallons. Pound of beef, 3,500 gallons. And again, to summarize, water is the most limiting factor in agricultural production.